Everyone blames Charles Manson for the Tate murders. They're looking at the wrong person. The official story is simple enough. Manson was a drifter, a small-time criminal with delusions of grandeur who brainwashed a handful of vulnerable young people into committing murders on his command. He twisted scripture, manufactured a race war prophecy he called Helter Skelter, and orchestrated the deaths of Sharon Tate and 6 others in the summer of 1969. Close the file. Manson was evil, case solved, but I've read court testimony, parole board interviews, and contemporaneous accounts that don't quite fit that narrative. There's a piece missing. There's an organization that shaped Manson's theology before he ever met his followers, and for decades, almost no one talked about them. In 1966, before Helter Skelter, before the family, Manson spent time in Los Angeles moving through various spiritual circles. He was searching. He'd been in prison for most of his adult life, and when he emerged, the counterculture was in full bloom. Gurus, communes, Eastern mysticism, and apocalyptic Christianity were everywhere. Manson was hungry for ideology. He absorbed everything. But one group in particular would leave a permanent mark on his thinking: the Process Church of the Final Judgment. The Process Church was founded in 1965 by Robert de Grimston and his wife Mary Ann McLaren. They were British, educated, and they'd spent years in Scientology before breaking away to form something far darker. The Process operated out of London initially, but by 1967, they'd established themselves in Los Angeles. They published slick magazines, held public meetings, and recruited from the same countercultural pool Manson was fishing in. What made them dangerous wasn't their size. They were never large, but their theology. The Process Church taught that Jesus Christ and Lucifer were equal forces locked in eternal opposition. Not good versus evil in the traditional sense, rather two complementary cosmic principles. They believed in a final apocalyptic judgment where these forces would reconcile. Members were encouraged to embrace both light and darkness. They wore black robes. They published materials depicting Satan with reverence. They preached that the coming judgment would be violent, necessary, and purifying. Now, Manson was charismatic, but he wasn't original. What people often miss is how much of his later theology came directly from Process teachings he'd absorbed. The apocalyptic framework, the idea of a final judgment, the notion that violence could be redemptive, the blending of Christian and satanic imagery. Manson took those seeds and weaponized them. He simplified them. He made them personal. He made them about him. What's crucial is the timing. Manson was in contact with Process members in late 1967 and early 1968. This was before he'd fully formed the family. This was when he was still developing his worldview, still collecting ideas. Process members have been interviewed over the years, and some acknowledged meeting him, discussing philosophy with him. They didn't recruit him, but they exposed him to a framework that would become Helter Skelter. The Process Church itself never advocated violence. I want to be clear about that. They were bizarre, esoteric, deeply uncomfortable, but they weren't murderers. However, they created a language, a cosmology that someone like Manson could exploit. They legitimized the idea that darkness and violence were cosmic principles, not moral failures. That's the danger of ideology. It doesn't pull the trigger, but it loads the gun. By 1969, when Manson orchestrated the Tate murders, the Process Church was being investigated by law enforcement, harassed by critics, and slowly falling apart. Manson was in prison, his family fractured. The connection between them seemed irrelevant to the official narrative. The murders were Manson's doing. Helter Skelter was Manson's prophecy. Case closed. Except it wasn't quite that simple. Here's what the conventional narrative misses. Manson didn't invent his theology in a vacuum. He was a scavenger, pulling from everything around him. The Process Church provided the raw material. LSD provided the intensity. The counterculture provided the permission structure. Manson provided the pathology. None of these alone caused the murders, but together they created a perfect storm. Investigators never fully pursued the Process Church connection. There was no conspiracy, no smoking gun, but there was influence, there was a framework. There was a language of apocalyptic violence that Manson adopted and weaponized. When you study the actual theological statements Manson made to his followers, the echoes of Process teaching are unmistakable. The final judgment, the reconciliation of opposites, the necessity of destruction. What this reveals is uncomfortable. It means the Tate murders weren't simply the act of one madman. They were the convergence of cultural forces, a fringe religious movement, a drug-soaked generation, a charismatic psychopath, and a moment when the counterculture's utopian dreams were curdling into something darker. Manson didn't emerge from nowhere. He emerged from a world that, in subtle ways, made him possible. The Process Church itself dissolved by the early 1970s. Members scattered. De Grimston died in obscurity decades later, The organization left almost no institutional trace, but its ideas didn't disappear. They seeped into popular culture, into conspiracy theories, into the dark corners of the internet where apocalyptic ideologies still fester. The same patterns that made Manson dangerous, the blending of mysticism and violence. The appeal to cosmic justification, appear again and again in modern cults. So when we tell the Manson story, we usually stop at Manson. He's the villain, he's the explanation, but that's incomplete history. Manson was a symptom. The process church was one of many symptoms. The real story is how ideology, even fringe esoteric ideology, shapes the violent acts of susceptible individuals. How a charismatic leader can harvest ideas from a culture and transform them into murder. I've spent years reading about cults, and the lesson is always the same. They don't emerge in isolation. They are products of their moment. The process church emerged in the 1960s because the 1960s made it possible, because people were searching for meaning outside traditional institutions, because drugs and mysticism were converging, because apocalyptic thinking was in the air. Manson emerged for the same reason. The soil was prepared. This doesn't excuse Manson. It doesn't reduce his culpability. He made choices. He murdered. He deserves his sentence. But understanding where his ideas came from, how they were shaped by movements like the process church, gives us a clearer picture of how violence actually happens, not as a bolt from the blue, but as the convergence of ideology, psychology, and opportunity. The process church of the Final Judgment has been largely forgotten. Most people have never heard of them, but their influence rippled through one of the most notorious crimes of the 20th century. They remind us that ideas matter, even obscure, fringe ideas. Even ideas that seem harmless when you first encounter them. In the hands of the wrong person, in the right moment, they can become catastrophic. The next time someone tells you the Tate murders were just Manson's doing, you'll know there's more to it. Not a conspiracy, not a cover-up, just a more complete history. One that traces ideology, influence, and the dangerous alchemy of ideas meeting pathology. Because understanding how cults work, how they spread their influence, how they shape the violent acts of their members, that's how we recognize the warning signs before they appear again. Subscribe. Every week we uncover the hidden connections between history's most infamous cults and the violence they inspired.